My name is Kurt Wise. I'm going to talk about the fossil record. This particular presentation is different from the two presentations I'm giving on the paleontology and the flood later on today in the electives. This is and there's very little overlap between the two. This is going to focus on some major features of the fossil record as it relates to the question, how was the fossil record formed? Basically, the theme is that the major features of the fossil record, the big features of the fossil record, are better explained by deposition or formation in the flood of Noah than by any other explanation. And so, first of all, there's the issue of how a fossil is formed at all. Let's say that let's say you're an organism that has a special desire to become part of the fossil record. Is there something you can do to make that happen, or what can increase your chances of making this happen? So the question is, how do you become a fossil at all? One of the first challenges, if you are an organism that's interested in that, is you got to avoid the carnivores. Critters that are out to get you, out to eat you, because typically the carnivores will consume you, crunch you up into little pieces, and alas, you're not part of the fossil record as a consequence. So for the most part, carnivory usually takes an organism out of the running for being a fossil, but and perhaps you can do something about that while you're still alive. But once you're dead, you got another problem, which you probably can't do anything about once you're dead, is you've also got a group of organisms known as scavengers that are designed to consume you as well. And of course, this is all part of the design, both in carnivory and in scavenging, to take the components of living organisms, break them up into primary building components that can be used by other organisms to build other organisms. And so it's a design in the system to make sure that we don't accumulate dead debris and at the same time have plenty of nutrients for the next generation of organisms. And so in the modern world, this process of carnivory and scavenging is actually rather efficient in taking out most organisms, preventing them from becoming fossils at all. The consequence of this, for example, you can take even catastrophes that occur in the present, and I'll take one, an anthropogenic catastrophe, which was the near extinction of the buffalo, the bison in North America. They were killed by the millions, literally, and left to rot. So in those circumstances, we've killed them. We usually didn't do anything other than maybe strip their skin off and left the carcass there. Leaving the carcasses in the open, again, literally by the millions, but to my knowledge, there's not a single fossil known from any of that devastation. And that's because the scavengers took out 99.9% of all evidence of those living things. And again, the point is that in this world, for somewhat obvious reasons, this process of scavenging is supposed to be efficient at taking out organisms. And so how do you get around this? Well, the best way to get around it really is to get your carcass buried so that the scavengers can't find it, although there are scavengers designed to find those things in the sediment. So you've probably got to get buried a good piece before you can get away finally from the scavengers. But alas, the problem still is not over, because for the organisms that do in fact get buried, the organisms that do escape both carnivory and scavenging, there are other organisms designed to decompose bodies beyond that. Optimally you want to get the the body into the anoxic zone where there's no oxygen, and then most scavengers require oxygen, so they're not going to be living, even if they tried burrowing down there, they're not going to be able to survive in those depths, because at the surface of the sediment, if you don't get buried too far, you've got a zone where oxygen is available due to burrowing of organisms primarily, but also in the sediment itself. There are decomposers designed to decompose organics in the shallow burial zone. And again, they're extremely efficient, but alas, if you do get beneath that zone, and I've already referred to the fact that that zone in some most marine environments, shallow marine environments, is on the order of 30 feet into the sediment. You've got to get buried at an extremely great depth to get beneath these burrowers. These burrowers go down quite a ways to oxygenate the sediments and decompose the organic matter. But even, alas, if you can in fact get to that point where you're below the oxic zone and there is no oxygen in there, sure, it's no longer possible for the aerobic decomposers, scavengers, or carnivores to get you, but alas, there's bacteria that already reside within you and within any organism that will begin the process of decomposition even in the anaerobic environment. Anaerobic decomposition is much slower than aerobic decomposition, but they've got a lot of time. They're buried deeply. They're not probably going to get disturbed over time. And again, it's just extremely unlikely that any organism at all would get decomposed or would make it into the fossil record in the modern world situation. You add to that once, let's say, you survived somehow the process of anaerobic decomposition, you still exist. Now, if your dream is to get into a museum drawer preserved as a fossil and not destroyed, you've also got to get back up to the surface again so that somebody can find you. And yet, how do you get to the surface? Well, the rocks around you are eroded away so that you're brought to the surface in that fashion. But if it erodes too far, you're taken out by the erosion process. So you've got this extremely delicate, if you really want to be a fossil, it just seems like it's impossible to ever make it happen. As a consequence, very few organisms in the present world, under present processes, ever would make it into, and ever do, and ever can make it into the fossil record. So in what I might call a conventional perspective on this, where most fossils are formed under conditions we experience today, and that would be the uniformitarian understanding of the origin of fossils, you would expect that because slow deposition dominates in the modern world, you would expect that fossilization is extremely rare, and that fossils would be more often poorly preserved. If they did make it, you're only going to get a very poor preservation in that process. On the other hand, and I'm going to contrast throughout the presentation these two perspectives, forming fossils or in a modern world situation versus the idea, just a conceptual, basic, intuitive understanding of a flood, lots of deposition, very rapid deposition, burying your fossils very quickly in a flood scenario. No specific details about it, but just kind of what might you expect under those circumstances. Because the flood is burying lots of organisms very deeply, hundreds of feet in the matter of probably hours or days, we're not too much likelihood that you're going to get nailed by a carnivore before you're subsumed. The scavengers have very little opportunity to nail you, and even the anaerobic, and it's too deep for the aerobic decomposers and the diggers and that sort of thing to get to you. Anaerobic decomposition is about the only thing you have to fear under these circumstances. And the burial is so great, and the organisms so many, that you might expect even anaerobic decomposition is only going to get a small percentage of the organisms. So you might expect under those circumstances, just an intuitive level expectation of a flood theory, that you would have fossils being very common, and overall very often well preserved. As a matter of fact, you might expect, and this is going to be another thought we're going to come to in a moment, that maybe even a large percentage of the organisms would actually get preserved as fossils, which is a mind-boggling concept here compared to the conventional wisdom. So in terms of the quality of fossil preservation overall, you might expect that in flood theory you'd have common, well-preserved fossils, but in conventional theory, fossils would be rare and poorly preserved. What do you actually see? I'm a little biased, but when I walk up to fossils, I got out of a car, what was it, a couple of days ago at a Cracker Barrel, and my wife went one direction towards the Cracker Barrel, and my attention was diverted immediately to something underneath the tree in the island there. Beneath the tree, there was a bunch of rocks there. And alas, I thought I saw from 15, 20 feet away some fossils in the rocks. And alas, I walked over there, thousands of fossils. I mean, a slab of rock, the first one I saw, probably had 500 individual fossils on that single rock. And as I looked around, all of them had fossils. In many rock deposits, many rocks, you can find fossils by the billions. I've been more recently working with some vertebrate fossils. My training is in invertebrate paleontology. In invertebrate paleontology, fossils are abundant. Vertebrate paleontologists get really excited when they see 16, 20, specimens, and I can go up to a rock outcrop with just my pockets and put 700 specimens in my pockets. I have a problem with dinosaur fossils. If I'm on a plane trip to wherever I'm going, I can't take even one bone back with me. It's too big. And so invertebrate fossils, there are fewer of them. But a friend of mine, Art Chadwick, is working on a dinosaur site. He's taken out 1,000 dinosaur specimens every year from one layer. He's been doing that for 20 years. Since 1996, he's taken out over 1,000 bones every single year. And we estimate that he can be doing that at that site for the next 50 years and hardly make a dent on that. So even vertebrate fossils, even though they're far less common than the invertebrate fossils, there are many of them, extraordinary numbers of them. Overall, it's kind of hard to find a rock, in fact, that doesn't have fossils in it. And so overall, it seems that the flood theory intuitively fits the observation of the fossil record a little bit better than the conventional model. A second issue, which I've already referred to, at least I warned you that it was coming, is the issue of the completeness of the fossil record. What percentage of the organisms that once lived do we have fossils for? Or in this particular case, I'm going to make it a little more specific, of all of the species that ever lived in the past, how many of them do we have a record of in the fossil record? How many species have been preserved as fossils? And I'm going to first begin with trying to calculate that or estimate that from conventional theory. What would conventional theory expect on this particular issue? Now, this is looking at the geologic record from the Cambrian, for the animal record, from the Cambrian all the way up to the tertiary. This is how do we say it? It's a species abundance curve. It's a taxonomic abundance curve. This was initially done at the family level for marine organisms. And what you get is a very low diversity. Very few families of organisms are found in the early Cambrian, but the number of families increases through the Ordovician, reaching a maximum, a plateau that stays somewhat constant through what's called the Paleozoic, drops rather precipitously and increases again through the Mesozoic and continues to increase to the present. And again, initially this was done at the level of families. Jack Sikorsky did this a number of years ago, back in the 1980s. He then spent the rest of his life, just before he died, actually having successfully done this for genera in the fossil record. It gets basically the same curve, the same form of curve. So overall, this is a diversity diagram as a function of time. And of course, the conventional dates are here on the bottom. It's from this curve that we can then estimate the true density or the expected completeness of the fossil record. Because here's how the reasoning would go. If, in fact, let's say, for the sake of argument, we had two species that existed for the entire duration of the record, species A and species B, the diversity curve would be flat, and it would be 2. There would be 2 across the entire history of life. How would we go from this curve to a calculation of the number of species that existed in the past? We know the number of species, that's 2. And how would you do this? What you would do is take the area under the curve, which is 2 times 600 million, to get 1,200 million year species. Okay, that's an interesting unit, what that unit means. But and then we would divide by the average species duration. The average species duration is 600 million years. This species has its species duration of 600 million years. The other one has a species duration of 600 million years. So if you divide this, the area under the curve by 600 million years, you get 2, which is the right answer. You get two species. So we're going to do the same thing with this curve. We take the area under the curve, we integrate under the curve to get a number of taxa times million years, and then we divide by the average species duration. The average species duration is about 25 million years when you go through all the work and to figure that out in the fossil record. So when you do that calculation, so it's actually possible from this to determine an estimate of how many species lived in the entire duration of Earth history if this curve represents, or that curve represented the actual diversity of taxa through time. Total number of species which have ever lived is something in excess then by this calculation of 50 billion. 50 billion species at least have lived, because we're going to assume for the moment that the record that we do have is incomplete. But there's a minimum, based on the record we do have, of 50 billion species that have ever lived on the fossil record. But we've only named to date about 250,000 fossil species. Okay, so we can then calculate the number, how many of all of the species that have ever lived in the past do we actually have a fossil record of, just simply by taking 250,000 and dividing it by 50 million. And so we have far less than 1%, far less than 1%. And again, this is going to be there's more than 50 billion species. So it's going to be far less than 1% of all the species that have ever lived are known as fossils. And this is a common statement. This is a statement I heard in my very first paleontology course at the University of Chicago. Far less than 1% of all the species that have ever lived do we have fossils for. So what is the completeness of the fossil record with respect to species? Far less than 1% of all the species that ever lived are known as fossils. And I'm going to put a parenthetical note in here. Creationists have bought this. Creationists have just simply quoted that and said, alas, far less than 1% of all the species that have ever lived are found in the fossil record. And bunk! That's garbage. That is calculated on the basis of the assumption that the fossil record is representing 600 billion years of time and so on. So, but conventional theory would expect that the species completeness of the fossil record is extraordinarily low, far less than 1%. So let's now look more properly at a flood model concept. And again, I'm just going to do it intuitively. I might expect a pretty high percentage, given, now it's probably not going to be very high for certain organisms, for small organisms that have no hard parts, but if we restrict it to the 7 animal taxa that are easily preserved in the fossil record, which is most of that curve, the Sepkoski curve that I showed you, then I would expect it's probably not far away from being true to say we've got 100% of the species preserved from the world that was before. At least the world that was existent right at the time of the flood, we probably have an extremely good sample. If I'm going to be conservative, I'll say it's 50% or something like that. But anyway, it's a whole lot. It's at least 4 orders of magnitude higher species preservability than the conventional model would expect. So there's our expectations. There's quite a bit of difference between those two. How do we test between the two? There's a simple way to test it, which is we've got living species today. Let's figure out how many living species we have today have a fossil record. And by the way, that little seems like it's obvious in one sense, but that's going to be a little low because the species that live today in the conventional wisdom, we're only on the average halfway through the species duration of the species that live today. So we're only giving it half a chance to collect living species in the fossil record. But even then, just a rough estimate of the quality of the fossil record would be there are this many mammals in Europe, and Curtain back in the 70s was in Europe. He simply did, here's how many mammal species are in Europe. And how many of the European mammal species have a fossil record in Europe? 70%. 70% of the living mammal species in Europe have a fossil record in Europe. When you ask the question, if they have a fossil record anywhere on the planet, it raises to above 80%. Jim Valentine did the same thing for mollusks. His dissertation was on fossil clams and that sort of thing in Baja California. So it was easy for him to count how many clams and snails and stuff like that were in Baja California living today, and then how many of them have a fossil record in Baja California. 75% of the living species have a fossil record. That suggests the fossil record's pretty good somehow, which is not what we would have expected intuitively. But somehow the fossil record is capable of picking up a very large percentage of species. And in places after places and taxa after taxa, we're getting extremely high preservation rates for species. That does not fit the conventional theory at all. It is much more within the lines of a catastrophic theory, of rapid burial of organisms. Another issue I want to talk about is disparity in diversity. The conventional wisdom, as you well know, is that organisms evolve through time in somewhat small steps. either gradual change or stepwise change. It doesn't matter for our purposes here. The point is that in order to get great disparity, and disparity is a measure of how different things are. So the question here would be, if you start with a bacterium, how do you get something as different as a human and an oak tree? How do you go from a bacterium to something really different and something really different from that? You can't do it by hiccuping and jumping over to the oak tree in the conventional theory. You have to do it step by step by step by step by step by step. Okay, it takes a long time and takes a lot of steps. In these steps, you've produced a bunch of species along the way. If you count how many species we have, we're increasing the species as we go up the tree. In order to get a wide tree, which would represent great disparity, you've got to have lots of branches have come up. You must increase the diversity of organisms in order to get to great disparity. So in the fossil record, you should see low diversity at first, increasing diversity with time, which, if you remember that diagram that I showed you, is roughly what we see there at the beginning of the fossil record. It's increasing in diversity with time. That's what you would expect with the evolutionary tree. But this is a little different. This is asking, what about disparity? A measure of disparity. Number of taxa doesn't tell you disparity. Disparity is you got to look at how different they are. In order to get great disparity, you need lots of time, and and diversity will increase before disparity. This is actually an argument by Stephen Jay Gould, and disparaging argument since he was disparaged by it. The conventional theory is that high diversity must come before high disparity. You just can't do it any other way. You can't poof disparity into being in evolution. You can poof it in creation, but you can't poof it in evolution, okay? And so now in the flood concept, however, let's think about that. It's not creation's flood. I'm thinking only flood here. Let's say we took our present Earth and had a flood come in and take it out. Let's make it simpler. Let's take what the organisms are right here in where we're at. Let's say a big wave comes in, picks up all the organisms, plants, animals, sort of dumps them in. Let's say we have high preservation rate, so we're going to preserve most of them. What's going to be the disparity? The disparity is extremely high. We have oak trees, we have humans, we have bacteria, we have a wide variety. We have full disparity. You sample any community in the world, any community, just any one community in the world, and you've got high disparity. You've got the full disparity of life in just about every community of the world. So every grab of the real world by the flood will preserve high disparity. What about its diversity, though? It's got high disparity, but there's probably only a few hundred species all total with plants, animals, and the whole bit. So you have the full disparity, but out of 1.8 million species in the world, you have a very low diversity. So the flood, I would expect in the very first moments of the flood, you're going to get complete disparity. You're going to get the full disparity of life, but a very low diversity. So in the flood theory, we would expect low diversity at the base of the flood, where at the same time that you have high disparity. So that disparity should actually come before diversity. So the two models have opposite expectations. You have high diversity comes before disparity in conventional model, and high disparity comes before high diversity in the creation model. What do you actually see? The observation is You already got the idea here in this talk where these things are going to go. It is, from the beginning, the fossil record shows extremely high disparity with low diversity. Stephen Jay Gould wrote a whole book on one fossil layer, which is very close to the base of the Cambrian, known as the Burgess Shale. In that book, he focuses on the arthropods that are preserved in the Burgess Shale. He kind of ignores the trilobites. If you take the non-trilobite arthropods in the Burgess Shale, there are 21 species. 21 species of non-trilobite arthropods. Of those 21 species, if you tried to put them into modern classes of arthropods, that's the next classification down from phylum Arthropoda, there's only 5 modern classes of arthropods, but there's 20 classes of arthropods in the Burgess. 21 species representing 20 classes. That's extraordinary. Not only is the diversity low compared to disparity, it's only one more species than there are classes, but there's more disparity there than there is in the present. So the very oldest, and it's a beautiful, it's a deposit that does an extraordinary job of preserving things, so much so that you can dig through the fossil and do internal anatomy of the organism. You can work down through the layers and get the layers of the organism. I mean, you're destroying the organism as you do it, unfortunately, but it's just spectacular preservation. So we're preserving everything in there, and what we're seeing is extraordinary disparity with very low diversity. When the spiny skinned echinoderms come in, very oldest echinoderms come in, that's a phylum. There are, again, more classes of echinoderms in the very oldest deposit of echinoderms than there are in the present. And so rather than there being high diversity before disparity, Stephen Jay Gould disparaged the fossil record in saying that it has extremely high disparity before diversity, and what we see subsequent is decimation, the literal old meaning of decimation. To decimate, deci would be tenth. It's to wipe out. It's for a Roman legion to go in and fight and be decimated, that only 1 out of 10 make it. It is decimated, okay? That's what the fossil record shows. We have this extraordinary disparity and subsequent decimation to the present. The present is a decimated world compared to the world of the past. Not the expectation of conventional theory, but the expectation of flood theory. Another issue, order of first appearance. This was an issue I was challenged with all the way through my training as a paleontologist. I heard multiple times, the fossil record preserves evidence of evolution. The fossils appear in the order that evolution predicts. Heard this over and over again. And I didn't have time to deal with it while I was going through. I waited until I finished. So in the summer following the completion of my doctorate, I then sat down with 7 of what I thought were the best evidences of evolution to see if in fact there was a creationist understanding or reinterpretation of them. And this is one of them. It's the order of first appearance. Is finally able to address this issue. In conventional theory, we would expect the order of first appearance should be the same order as the branching order of evolution. The very oldest branches on the evolutionary tree should show up at the bottom of the fossil record, and then subsequently, as you got later branches, they should be the later fossils. It's as simple as that. What would you expect in flood theory? Probably, at least if we just do an intuitive, let's not think about this very deeply, we just pick up the organisms of the earth and just boom, just dump them into the earth. You might expect random, at least with respect to evolutionary theory. If you thought about it a little bit more, you might expect, and it was commonly believed by creationists from way back, that the flood isn't an instantaneous picking up of everything on the earth. It transgresses onto the land. So you might expect that it's going to take, it's going to preserve things in the ocean, bury things in the ocean first, and then work its way up onto the land, burying things from sea to land. You might expect that to be a second order pattern. So there's a contrast. How do we test this? Testing this is not easy, but the idea first is to create an evolutionary tree of everything, which nobody's ever done. Nobody did before I did it. Everybody thought I was crazy to do it. Now it's a little bit easier with different methods we have now with computers and so on. We can do this more effectively. But at the time, it was a matter of going through all of the organisms of the planet, from bacteria to protists to just the whole kit and caboodle, and figuring out a complete evolutionary tree. This is only part of the tree. Contains the viruses, the archaebacteria, the eubacteria, and then there's another part of the tree. It's here. It's another branch. It keeps on going. This is only part of it, because this is all basically the protista and we call them algae, and then the fungi. We still have two other branches, the plants and the animals, to add in here. You just can't put it on one. Well, I could, but it's hard enough to read as it is. And here's the plant groups, and then the animal groups. So think of all those things onto one big tree. It's one big tree. And this is only bringing it down to orders. So this is the kingdoms, the phyla, divisions in the plants, and the classes and the orders. So we're not talking about the families and the genera, so just down to the level of orders. So now that I have an evolutionary tree, I can now determine an order of branching. For example, the pharaonids are supposed to have evolved then, if the evolutionary tree is accurate, before the brachiopods, and the hyolithids after that. The mollusks, some of these things I couldn't resolve at the time. The annelids last of all. So you'd expect pharaonid fossils to be found before brachiopod fossils, found before hyolithid fossils, and so on. That's the simple interpretation of what I'm about to do here. So we create an order of branching of the tree, compare that with the order of appearance of organisms in the record, and what you end up with after you do this hideous amount of work is that 95% of the lineages, if you started from the base and went all the way up through all the possible lineages, 95% of the order of fossil appearance is random with respect. In other words, I can't reject the null hypothesis of randomness with respect to evolution. There is no correspondence between the order of evolution and the order of fossils. There's at least of orders on up. There's nothing there. But, and 95% at an alpha of 5%, you would say, there's nothing left to explain. But that 5% is intriguing. It's hard to let go of that and say, well, what about the 5%? And we are valid. I think it's valid to reject the 5% and say we don't have to worry about it. But the 5% that's left, which includes the plants, the vertebrate classes, are a sea to land transition. That's all that is, that order corresponds when the evolutionary order happens to be a sea to land order, that the fossils in fact do follow a sea to land order. So it might actually be not evolution, but the flood In any case, the general order of first appearance of organisms in the fossil record, of higher taxa in the fossil record, is at a first order approximation random with respect to evolution, and at a second order it is a sea to land transition, exactly what Flood would predict. Another issue is a change up section question. In conventional theory, we have evolution occurring. So in theory, A evolves into B while sediments are being deposited. So you would expect that under these circumstances, you should find in sediments A on a lower sedimentary layer, lower strata, B in a higher strata, and then the intermediates in between. There's continuous change that is assumed in conventional theory. And if you're speaking of a divergence, a speciation event, or taxonomic origination event of some sort or another, then you would expect that that should show up as a divergence of morphology from a common ancestral position. So you would expect not just what creationists call transitional forms in between, but you would also expect divergence of morphology as a function of stratigraphic position. That's the prediction of the conventional theory. What about flood theory? Well, if we have the three organisms, A, B, and C, that I formerly had evolving from one another in evolutionary theory, if we're thinking about a flood theory, we're thinking these three organisms lived at the same time. They were sampled by the fossil record, tossed into the fossil record. If we assume for the moment they were put in some sort of random position with respect to them in the fossil record, the species A was sampled by the fossil record. Kind of picture it as something reaching out to sample something and preserving fossils. It might sample A for a period of time, but it's always sampling A. So you would expect that A might be found at several levels as A. And meanwhile, it's sampling B, but always sampling B, so it would be preserved in the record as BBBB, and likewise with C. So in a flood model, you might expect that what you'd actually see is taxon A being preserved unchanged through some range of the stratigraphic record, and C through some range, B through some range, each of them showing no change because they're being sampled from the same population. So you would expect stasis and abrupt appearance. Stasis means that any given taxon remains unchanged as you go up the sequence. And abrupt appearance means when you find A, and there's no transition from A to A from anything else. There's no transition from A to anything else. They abruptly appear and they abruptly disappear, and they're in stasis while they're in existence in the fossil record. Now, you probably recognize these terms. I've stolen the terms from Stephen Jay Gould in, again, another disparaging summary of the fossil record, disparaging from his point of view, of the fossil record, because it was what he was most famous for was observing that in the fossil record of species, stasis and abrupt appearance is the primary, what you primarily see in the fossil record. So whereas you would expect continuous change and divergence of taxa that in evolutionary theory, you would expect stasis and abrupt appearance in creation theory, and what you actually observe is stasis and abrupt appearance. Now, Steve Gould argued for stasis and abrupt appearance of species. This is a general argument for stasis and abrupt appearance of taxa, all taxa, genera, families, and so on all the way up. What Steve is known for is arguing for this on a species level, and he spent most of his life trying to make this argument. He more or less won the argument. The paleontological world ultimately accepted this claim reluctantly, but the reluctantly because it didn't fit. I mean, it simply doesn't fit what you'd expect in evolutionary theory. Now, it wasn't necessarily that they understood that it fit a flood model, but it does. In fact, I came into Steve's office one day and said, "Hey, Steve, I've just made Punkek," which was Steve Gould's explanation for stasis and abrupt appearance in the light of conventional theory. I said, "I've just made Punkek into a creationist theory. It's this idea, okay? And you want to hear." And he says, "Well, that's interesting." And so we've got and he admitted to me at that moment, he says, "Your theory does explain more paleontological data than mine. But I can't go there. I can't believe that because, of course, that's a flood and that's a God that judges and all of that sort of thing." Later in his life, again, from his graduate school years, for a number of years, he's known for arguing for stasis and abrupt appearance of species. But he recognized early on, no one in paleontology can not recognize this, that this same feature describes not just species, but every taxonomic level. Most disturbingly would be things like phyla and classes and so on and so forth. And there's a paper he wrote later in his life where he said, it's interesting that the same pattern of stasis and abrupt appearance we see in species seems to also be true at higher taxonomic levels, at all taxonomic levels. We have developed a theory for explaining a species stasis and abrupt appearance. We do not have a theory in evolution to explain the higher level stasis and abrupt appearance. And he called for the evolutionary theory, he called for a revolution. He called for evolution to find a solution to this because this is a big, huge problem for evolution. In his last book that he wrote, literally finished on his deathbed, the whole book is devoted to that issue. We have to find the evolutionary theory to explain this because it's not just true at species level, it's true at every single taxonomic level, and there is no evolutionary explanation for that. So here is a general pattern of the fossil record, which fits a flood model comfortably and is extraordinarily challenging for the conventional model. Another issue is the issue of stratomorphic intermediates, which is somewhat related to the last one, and a little more specific. A stratomorphic intermediate is a stratigraphic intermediate and a morphological intermediate. Strato from strata, morpho from morphology. It is an intermediate that is both in an intermediate position in the strata and an intermediate position in morphology. If, in fact, evolution is true, that A evolves into B, and goes through, or A evolves into C and goes through B to get there, then it should be that you will have a stratum that has A. Above it should be stratum with B, and above that should be stratum with C. And that would be, B then, would be the stratomorphic intermediate. It's stratigraphically between A and C, and it's morphologically between A and C. That's what you're looking for if you're an evolutionist. If you're an evolutionist, you would expect stratomorphic intermediates. This is, I guess, I hate the term, but this is what creationists call the missing link, okay? To use the term, by the way, is to buy into the evolutionary model because you're saying that there is something that is missing. So you're implying that there really is something. It's a very bad idea it's like Burger King saying, we're the second best, but this is what we're going, and everyone goes, what's the first best? So they think of McDonald's. You don't do an advertising campaign where you make the people think of your competitor. That's dumb. Okay, Pepsi did the same thing. Starts a commercial with the Coke, and shows the person drinking a Coke and go, oh, and he goes and goes through all sorts of things to get a Pepsi, and what do I think? And after I watch that commercial, I don't remember anything after the Coke. I just think of Coke. They just advertised for Coke. That's stupid, okay? Creationists should not call these things missing links because they're advertising for evolution. They're thinking, as an evolutionist, they're getting everybody to think, oh, there's links to be missing. No. Then you have to say missing links don't exist, and it's like, what? This is weird. Anyway, sorry, get off my soapbox there. What evolutionists are looking for are stratomorphic intermediates. That's that's what we want, okay? So in evolutionary theory, conventional theory, you would expect that, there should have been organisms that are intermediate, but remember, what's the preservation rate of the fossil record? It's less than 1% of all the species. So let's say you have two organisms and you have 1,000 species in between the two. If your preservation rate of species is far less than 1%, you might have one in there. So is it fair to say that you got species A and species B that you should expect to find the stratomorphic intermediate between the two if they are similar to each other? It's not fair. This is not a valid argument against evolution. You're burning straw men, okay? This is sad. Now, on the other hand, if you're talking about a transition between major groups, it requires hundreds of transitions. Now you're talking a little more fair, okay? Because if in fact you've got 3,000 transitions that must be made to get from A to B, then you would expect to find several stratomorphic intermediates in between. So they would expect them to be rare, relatively speaking. Only less than 1% of all of them would be preserved. And in some groups that are very well preserved, the preservation is high, for example, with clams and gastropods, things with shells that get preserved very well. You might expect these even to get towards the common. At least 1 in every 10 in many of the well-preserved groups. What do you expect in flood theory? Well, you might say, well, I wouldn't expect anything of that nature. Careful. This is a question for you. Which of these, assuming they did evolve, which of these evolved from which? Somebody give me an answer. Start where? The what? The bottom. You want to start at the bottom? Oh, you went backwards from what I suggested. Let's see. Let me do this. I'd start with the handle. Okay, so that's a possibility? Could it be that way? How about that way? How do you about that way? I'm trying to make a point here. When you have multiple organisms, how do you know which one was the starting one? Even if you know what's most similar to what and what the likely lineage, if you got A, I know B's somehow connected to it. But which one's first? Was A first and B first? How do you know? You don't know polarity. As a result, if you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different things in the fossil record, if you've got a possibility that it could start from this one, or 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 this one, and it could go in any number of directions, then what do you think the possibility is that if you randomly threw these puppies into the fossil record, into some random order, might you expect sometimes for the order to end up in a stratomorphic intermediate order, in a possible order? Since any of them could end up being intermediate in a theoretical sense, a random distribution of organisms will land you in a stratomorphic intermediate condition every once in a while. Because we do not know, in evolutionary theory, we do not know a priori what evolved from what. Did humans evolve from apes or apes from humans? We would not know that except with a fossil record. It's only post hoc. In a theoretical level, you might expect the bacteria are going to come before eukaryotic organisms. You'd expect one-celled eukaryotic organisms to come before multicellular eukaryotic organisms. But did the fungi evolve before the plants, or did they evolve after the plants? Did they evolve before the animals? Did the animals, when you get to the birds and the dinosaurs, is it the birds that evolved into the dinosaurs, or the dinosaurs into the birds? You would not know that except from the fossil record. So evolution is post-dicting the evolutionary order. It can't predict. It's got maybe 3 or 4 basic predictions, and that's about it. It can't make any further predictions. It does it post hoc. It does it based on the order actually seen in the fossil record. Given that, there is a possibility that a certain percentage of the time, stratomorphic intermediates might actually be thrown into place if, in fact, the order is random. So the observation, the comparison here, it's hard to differentiate between these two, but rare to common versus extremely rare, there may not be much of a distinction between it, but in most groups, it's none. In fact, 95% of the fossil record is shallow marine invertebrates. How many stratomorphic intermediates are known or claimed among the shallow marine invertebrates? 0. Not a single stratomorphic intermediate is known in the clams, the snails, all these well-preserved, 6 of the 7 well-preserved phyla in the fossil record have 0 stratomorphic intermediates. All claimed stratomorphic intermediates involve 2 claims in the plants and the rest in the vertebrates. That's it. And that is a very small percentage of the fossil record. The vertebrates are about 5%, actually the plants are about 5% of the fossil record, and the vertebrates far less than 1% of the fossil record. So almost all of the stratomorphic intermediates are in all of them are in 2 groups. The other groups, which are better preserved, have 0 stratomorphic intermediates. So I would suggest a little bit more on the direction of the flood here than an evolution. Issue of complexity. Intuitively, evolutionary theory would expect relatively low complexity. It's really difficult to explain high complexity. In the flood, you could have extremely high complexity if that's already there in the world. And of course, you already know the complexity of organisms in the fossil record is truly extraordinary. My favorite example are the trilobites. They have, here's some that we can actually take X-ray photos. We got the soft parts, and it's really cool. They got a locomotive system, which is amazing. They got a respiratory system. They got a circulatory system. They got a nervous system. And in their nervous system, they have these incredible eyes. There's a problem with hard lenses, like a lens like I'm wearing to correct my vision. It's fine when you're close to the center of the lens, but as you get further and further away from the center of the lens, it's difficult to focus. In fact, it's basically impossible to focus the rays on the focal point, so you have fuzziness around the edge, which is called optical aberration, spherical aberration in hard lenses. There are ways, however, we've found 2 solutions to solving that in creating the lens in a particular shape, bizarre shape. There's two different shapes have been found. A surface which is somewhat sinusoidal here, and a very much different surface. They were discovered respectively by two 17th century scientists, Huygens and Descartes. And so here's one example of Huygens solution. And in trilobites that use hard lenses, there is two hard lenses put together with slightly different refraction indices of refraction. They're using Huygens solution to the spherical aberration. That's mind-blowing. This is just amazing. Are you kidding? Wow. That is the complexity that, again, it just blows my mind. The complexity in the fossil record is extraordinary. There's a further issue that these trilobites are doing this in compound eyes. There's an advantage to compound eyes. You can see motion very effectively, far more effectively than simple eyes. And the eyes of these trilobites are designed in some cases to wrap around their head. There's some that wrap around the head even to the bottom of the head. So we've determined that they have overlapping three-dimensional vision on some of these things in a 360-degree zone all the way around them, underneath them, over them, 360 degrees, overlapping three-dimensional vision. And with the advantage of the compound eyes, being able to see motion, and in each individual lens, seeing without spherical aberration. This is like unnecessarily, amazingly perfect. It's the most extraordinary optical system we know of in any organism on the planet. They're dead now. They're killed in the flood. The complexity of organisms is truly spectacular. I'll go quickly through this. There's another issue. I have it in another talk. Organisms do a very efficient job of bioturbating the sediment, getting rid of lamination in the sediment. In the modern world, lamination does not persist. The lamination that Steve was talking about in his talk. You go down days, weeks, months after the sediment has been deposited, and there ain't no lamination left. It's been bioturbated by organisms. And again, in the shallow marine world, 30 feet beneath the surface, complete homogenation. And because of this, you would expect that in a flood model where you bury things very quickly, even if there were burrowers there to bury, to bioturbate, if the sedimentation is too rapid, you're still going to, the burrowers aren't going to be able to destroy the lamination. So you would expect that in conventional theory, there should be most of the sediments of the world should be bioturbated, heavily bioturbated. Basically no lamination found in any sediments, especially shale, because the little critters love digging in the mud. And in flood theory, you would expect laminated sediments, and what you actually find are laminated sediments dominate. I mean, it's extremely difficult to find a bioturbated sediment. There are things called bioturbated sediments, but when you look at them more closely, you realize they're not bioturbated sediments. So the very existence of the commonness of lamination suggests that the flood model is fitting the data better. So whether you're talking about the rate of preservation, species completeness, diversity versus coming before disparity or disparity before diversity, first appearance order, change upsection, intermediate, stratomorphic intermediates, complexity or bioturbation, I would suggest that the flood model explains the major features of the fossil record much better than the conventional model does. Thank you.